if you enjoy the podcast, why not show your support by becoming a patron? By becoming a patron of the show, not only will you help me put the show together, but from time to time you'll get exclusive, extra World War II chat. To become a patron, visit the website www.podcast.com and click on donate, or you can find me at patreon.com/ww2podcast. And a big thank you to those who already support the show. I was reading the British Journal of Military History and an article caught my eye titled "The Psychological Impact of Airborne Warfare and the British Response to the Airborne Threat" by Dr Tim Jenkins. It's a brilliant article and I suggest you give it a read. I'll put a link on the website. Anyway, I thought I'd shoot Tim an email to see if he'd be willing to join me on the podcast. Tim, thanks for joining me. To start with, shall we begin before the war? I wondered if in the interwar years, if the British ever considered that an invasion threat or a strike force could come from the air.
You know, during the First World War, we're actually pretty air-minded, is probably a good way to describe it. And there's a lot of cooperation that starts to come through, particularly in Mesopotamia, between the Royal Air Force and the actual army. We're looking at these kind of joint operations. They're working quite well. That follows through post-war into the 20s. And again, we're pioneering ways of running bits of the empire using aircraft and dropping off forces. They're not parachute forces, but we're actually resupplying by air, and we're actually ahead of the game, believe it or not, in the 20s.
What happened? How come we have no airborne forces in 1939?
It's just one of those classics, isn't it, Angus? I think, it was a good way of policing an empire, and then we come to the 10-year rule. We decide it's all right, we're not going to war again, and it's your classic investment strategies. And if you kind of look what happens in the socio-economic context of the UK, particularly 20s, 30s, Wall Street crash, there's the whole depression aspect, and the investment just isn't there.
It's interesting. It never occurred to me that for Britain, for Britain with this relatively small army, airborne transport could have been wildly useful, one would have thought, to maintain your army small, because you can move them about rather than have to keep garrisoning in places. It's a surprise that no one had sort of come to that conclusion.
It's your perfect solution, and we're using it around the empire, but we're not necessarily using it in Europe. So it's a great way to get your police force around and about, to put down small uprisings, small excursions. It's amazing what you can do if you airlift a bit of artillery or shift some machine guns around. And if you can do that by air, then actually you've got the critical advantage exactly when you need it. It's just something that, particularly in a European context, it doesn't really work that well, because there's something about the kind of the Western culture that, it's just not cricket.
Yes. I made a note to myself of not playing with a straight bat, which I thought was,
that's it. We're just terribly polite, aren't we?
Were we aware that other people were developing them? I mean, were we aware that the Germans had them and were experimenting them? And there's that dreadful phrase that gets bandied about now, that it was a paradigm shift. But they sort of were in many respects when they were used. It was a real new innovation. How aware were we that Germany was developing them?
Well, I mean, pretty much we knew it was going on, and we knew it was going on ironically because of the Soviets. There's mass kind of maneuvers in Minsk in 1936. And the Soviets kind of start to pioneer this. They get a bit interested in it. It's not particularly elegant, Angus. It's probably fair to say. It's pretty it's pretty agricultural. But what they're starting to demonstrate is moving troops and equipment around on a large scale. So they invite everybody to Minsk to come and have a look at this in 36. So we send Wavell. General Wavell goes and has a look. He's not particularly impressed, doesn't think it's for us, as a British. But the one chap that is there, who takes it on in a big way, is Student. Kurt Student really sees the potential in this. It fits perfectly into the Blitzkrieg model that they're developing. And off he goes and quietly cracks on. Right under everyone's nose.
Yeah, well, it does perfectly fit into that idea of extending things beyond the front line to cause trouble. which we seem to have missed out on as an idea, or shelved. Well, is probably a better way of putting it.
Well, we just can't see the future in it, and really it comes down perhaps to a very similar approach around armoured warfare. You know, if you look at certainly what happens in France and the Low Countries, the French are doing quite well in terms of armour. They just don't deploy it right. Airborne warfare is on that same level.
I've just been reading the biography of Dorman Smith, Chink, and it's interesting that some of his ideas for armoured warfare were pilloried at the time for, you know, being radical, but it subsequently they have been adopted, and it's the same sort of thing that the British Army had the way it wanted to fight, and you get the feeling was sometimes somewhat blinkered to these newfangled ideas.
I think so, and I think technology takes a while to kind of meld through, and if we're not careful with the term technology, it's like what you hear now bandied around all the time in the press is the innovation, entrepreneurship, and all these other kind of big buzzy words. A lot of it's not new, it's just applications of things in a slightly different way. So that technology was there. It was just thinking about a slightly different approach to how it can be used on the battlefield in terms of conflict. The Russians have thought about this. You know, they're developing this. The Czechs have thought about this. The Poles are aware of this. It's just that the actual Germans capture it and develop it in a way that actually starts to work its way through into such an effective mode of warfare.
Well, I also wondered if we also partly have our head in the sand, because we've got the English Channel. So for, you know, centuries we've been protected by the English Channel. We have the biggest navy in the world by, you know, a huge margin. Even if you got your parachuters in, what are you going to do with them? So I wondered if it was a head in the sand sort of aspect going on there. You know, the Royal Navy is all powerful.
Well, you know, the Royal Navy won the Battle of Britain. If you listen to a few of the bits of revisionist historical aspects that are out there at the minute. But yeah, you're right, it's an island nation. Why should the Germans succeed where the French failed? There is that kind of sense of false security that still exists to a certain extent. And that's something that, you know, we need to remain aware of. And it's a big part of what comes out of the airborne aspects of conflict during World War II, and particularly from a British perspective. We are kind of very rudely awakened to the prospect of what can happen.
Pre-war, were the public aware of the airborne threat? But because I think the idea of the bomber always getting through was well known in the public sphere. But were they aware of any airborne threat from airborne troops, I should say, not just airborne in general?
Do you know, the press pick it up. The press are really quite interested in it. And it's not just the European press. You know, it's certainly, you know, kind of across the Atlantic as well throughout the 30s. And there's lots of bits and pieces going back and forth. There's General Godow, or Admiral Godow, should I say, on the German side, who's a bit like our Little Heart. You know, he's a bit of a military theorist. And yeah, he's talking about it. The French are predicting that the Germans will attempt an airborne invasion of the UK. You know, so it's there. There's very little kind of taken of it, really, in terms of evidence from the government taking it seriously at that time. But it's only when you actually get into the Blitzkrieg and you certainly get into the airborne invasions that existed in Scandinavia and then in the Low Countries that we start to think, well, hey up, this could start to affect us too.
Well, yeah, everything does change quite radically in sort of 1940. You get as you say, the seizing airfields in Norway. There's the huge glider success at, is it Eben Emael, where they captured
Eben Emael, yeah.
Impregnable fortress.
You're classic, isn't it? You know, it's that classic mentality of the safety is in the defence. So let's build a fortress. Let's link these fortresses together, and there we have our line. You know, the Masnedø line, exactly the same kind of concept. Whereas actually, the best thing to do is op it, and then once you've opped it, scare them after death. And that's exactly what happens at Eben Emael. You know, it's a very, very small force. They're using the German glider, which again is quite small scale to what we produce later on with your Horsers, you know, the DFS 230. But brilliantly, they got that under the wire earlier on during the war when they're using them to train the Luftwaffe effectively. there's no irony that the Luftwaffe really gains its advantage from sport gliding, and Lufthansa, becomes the biggest airline, the biggest public airliner in the world at the time. It's a really good way of training your forces slightly under the wire. And they're doing this with the Soviets as well. They're sending pilots out to the Soviet Union. Sport gliding, isn't it great? Actually, what you're doing, you're training for the future. So it was in front of us, absolutely in front of us. And whether we slightly turned a blind eye because no one could face up to the reality that maybe there'd be another conflict just around the corner, or whether we were, slightly behind the curve, as it were.
Yeah. What was the British government's reaction to these stunning successes in 1940?
Well, initially we kind of put it down, initially can't see it as a concept. It's very, very small scale. But gradually, as these kind of operations build up throughout 1940, particularly kind of ending with Eben Emael, there's a bit of a reality that, wait there, this might be something a bit bigger. Because particularly in Norway, a lot of the parachute forces, they don't get off to a really good start. There's still this psyche that parachutists go in, it's all over really quick. Actually, they lost an awful lot of very elite troops. Take a long time to train. They're an incredibly expensive commodity if you compare them to traditional infantry. So losing them and the kit that goes with it, particularly the transport aircraft and the close aerial support that's required, it's an expensive way of doing things. But once you take an airfield and you've captured that, then you can start to land troops in an air portable type way. And this is that kind of mixture, really. We've got the actual offensive forces, but then also the air portable troops. They're not going to parachute or jump out of anything, but once you've given them that stronghold, that's how they get in. And it's just rapid movement of troops from one place to another.
I mean, what could the British government do, after France has fallen and the Germans are staring across the channel at us? I mean, what could the British do to prevent airborne troops landing?
Well, in all honesty, you're spot on in terms of, what's going on the channel. British Expeditionary Force is not exactly in a healthy way, particularly in terms of materiel, let alone the actual troops themselves. We pretty much leave most of our kit over in France. We haven't got much left. But by this time, the press have actually started to pick up and the public are starting to get aware that this could be us next. So there is that fear. It's starting to breed. It's that classic kind of drip feed, and people are starting to become aware. They're already pretty scared of the bomber by this point as well. They know about that. Bomber will always get through. Baldwin's statement, that's still very much in the public psyche. They've seen what's gone on in Spain. They've seen what's gone on, immediately across the channel. So we need to come up with something. We've got to kind of pick something that raises morale and actually keeps people occupied and stops them thinking about it too much directly. It's that classic kind of subconscious manipulation. And so that's where we start to develop the concept of the Home Guard, really. And that's where it all starts to stem from. Our classic kind of childhood sitcom, the absolute quintessential English comedy actually is born out of this airborne threat.
Yeah, because the funny thing about the Home Guard, I have a note here to myself. This is where playing with a straight bat. I was going to tie that in. Have you seen The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp?
Yeah.
Well, this is where I sort of. I'm not quite sure what the question to pose is, but there's some sort of tie-up in my mind between the fact that you have the Home Guard being ultimately how effectual could they be, because it is sort of this idea of it's frightfully ungentlemanly, this parachuting in behind our lines when they're not coming at us. It's all very how Blimp is actually retired in the end because it is demonstrated that not playing with a straight bat wins the day. And so in the actuality, I wondered how realistic the Home Guard was and actually whether the people realised. I suspect people fundamentally knew that the Home Guard was very much a last-ditch defence.
There's various arguments. Could they have been effective? Could they have actually carried out this kind of guerrilla warfare that some were set up to do. I think there'd have been a bit of a pain, Angus, if I'm honest, but could they have actually repelled a full-scale invasion? Probably not, and I think we all kind of recognise that. But if you think of their initial name, Local Defence Volunteer Force, this is the bit for me. You've got that voluntary aspect in there. You've got defence. But local's the key one for me. It's about getting everybody together in those environments. And we take for granted now things like conurbation. Our cities are pretty massive there. A lot of this was going on in kind of villages. Communication isn't that good. You've got a radio. You've got the local bobby who might go around on his bike. It's almost kind of a bit of solidarity. And that's absolutely critical to the home front during this period of time. It's actual coming together to actually stand up and you're united in this common cause. And really, in terms of, the Home Guard, Local Defence Volunteer Force, Churchill's not happy with the whizzy title, always the propagandist. But they actually start to stitch those communities together in a sole purpose. And that's pretty critical stuff, particularly in 1940 when, it's looking pretty bleak.
Yeah, the idea of morale building. Did you think that was a conscious thing on the part of the government?
I think certainly from...
With the Home Guard?
Yeah, and I think certainly from Churchill's perspective, if you look at commando forces, this hit-and-run tactics, there is a certain amount of quick win in there. There very much is that idea that we need to give the public a bit of a boost. And so you do see that in certain airborne operations, hence probably why we took it on. Initially was, wait there, we could do with one of those. We can get a spectacular headline just exactly the same as the Germans had with their success stories. Ironically, they weren't that successful. The German airborne forces burned themselves out incredibly quickly in terms of actual airborne assault. They're used as elite kind of infantry later on, but certainly after Crete, they're not used again. But it's at Crete where it really picks up, because Crete is the first demonstration that an island can be taken by airborne forces alone. That's when we really start to get scared. It's not actually in 40, it's later in 41. But again, if you look at the press, the British media, it's really quite interesting. Mass observation reports are picking up on it. Mass observation are out there going, actually, this airborne stuff, you need to keep an eye on this because people are genuinely starting to panic and it's affecting morale. We don't want that kind of effect. And all we ever tend to hear about still is very much the effects of bombing and the Blitz, which was much more tangible, I think. It's so obvious, isn't it? If there's an air raid on and there's buildings destroyed and there's the actual kind of chaos, there's a smoke, and it's very, very easy to conjure up. But that kind of that veiled threat, the one that we won't be able to hear it, and then we might open the curtains in the morning and there's a couple of Fallschirmjäger stood in the veg plot. Psychologically, that really does start to play. During the invasion of the Low Countries, Holland in particular, there's some pretty far out press articles coming. They're in the Times and in all our kind of broadsheets. They're all picking up on them. Parachutists dressed as nuns. Parachutists dressed in Dutch uniform, dressed as policemen. All those people in society that you'd trust might not actually be who they're purporting to be. And the fact that the British press are picking up on it and feeding it in, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, really. It breeds that
hysteria.
Yeah.
I wondered if there was also the press sort of picked on. There's a pre-war obsession with the idea of fifth columnists. I think it possibly came out of the First World War. So you get films such as the 39 Steps. So it's not a big leap from pre-war, what they've seen on the pre-war to now with people parachuting in disguise.
Yeah. Well, the fifth columnist aspect, you're absolutely spot on. And we do start to intern people, don't we? That's the reality of it. We actually start to intern German and Austrian nationals. That starts happening pretty early on, really. That's in May. And then the Maltese follow suit. And that's how we start to kind of go through. So we have got a big concern. It's something that you see quite often, though, isn't it? The Reds under the beds type syndrome. And it's your classic kind of approach. That'll sort it. We'll lock them all up, because then they can't help and they won't be able to show the parachute forces where to go or hand them a nun's habit when they land. So they can, there is something about the manipulation of the public psyche at this point in time, or if you can kind of just deflect it onto something else, I'd much rather, you can almost imagine it, can't you? I'd much rather focus their attention on the tangible and the actual citizens that are non-British in the country at that particular time, and we'll intern them, and it's problem solved, and everyone pats themselves on the back. It's just that classic kind of method of control that you do see, unfortunately, in conflict. I think what starts to become quite interesting as it develops through is how that actually manipulates and plays out in people's real lives. So if you were a golf fan, during the 1940s, you're going to be pretty hurt, So the idea is that they're really good areas for Germans to land on. Glider forces in particular, parachute forces, all nice and flat, nice and green. You've got to dig them up, lads. And, just to add insult to injury, we're not sending kind of home guard or troops there. We're asking the members of those clubs to dig their own. Could you imagine it now? I mean, it's just those. We'll take down all the signposts in the country, so people have got no idea where they're going. And this at a time when we're actually starting to develop military camps in the middle of nowhere, so they're away from invasion zones, training zones, so it's safe, and no one can find their way around. It's actually, you can see where Dad's army starts to develop from. It's very much there.
Yeah. And you just sort of, certainly things like the signposts, I do wonder how much they were very much more galvanizing policy behind it rather than practicality. Because, I don't know how far they took the signposts out. I mean, but certainly, there's certain parts of Britain you wouldn't have thought you'd get them necessarily dropping into. You'd have thought maybe if you took them out in the southeast, it'd be more useful than, say, I don't know, not in the northwest.
Well, rural Shropshire, for example, it's just kind of, I can't imagine it had that much effort. But then if you look at what's kind of applied, particularly from a Home Guard and that civil defence perspective, there's no surprise that pillboxes kind of pop up where they do. Quite often they're at river points, but a lot of them are there to protect against airborne attack. They're on the open. That's the location where they are, because that's what they're expecting to come. A lot of early Home Guard training exercises are all based around airborne assault and repelling airborne assault.
Well, that was going to be the next question. What were the Home Guard expected to do to repel airborne assault?
Oh, sorry, I preempted you there.
Well, no, you led into it.
Well, the whole idea was to contain. That was the idea of the Home Guard and being in these local areas, was to just simply contain, while the regular forces could arrive and mop up those aspects. So if you look at some of the classic defensive mechanisms that the Home Guard has, we've got the pillbox, we've got various kind of invasion obstacles. So you've got quite a lot of our meres and mosses and lovely aspects of waterways that literally we're just chucking telegraph poles in the bottom and putting mines on the top, so seaplanes can't land. Practically, they'd have had a job. I mean, we're telling the public, Eden's actually there saying to the public, what you've got to do if you see a German parachute is to report it immediately to your local police station. I mean, I don't know what kind of comfort that's going to give you, when the local Bobby's going, thanks ever so much, son, you just go back. And it is just, though, that aspect of solidarity that's critical in this. And, yeah, they would have had some aspect of practical engagement. In all fairness, a parachutist isn't that much better armed than a Home Guard volunteer. They can't carry the kit. They haven't got the heavy resources or weaponry that we'd see in standard infantry. But the one thing about the Fallschirmjäger is they are very much trained and they are idolised as that elite. It's that almost Teutonic Knight incarnate approach. They're super fit, they're super trained, and they're super driven. And that's something that comes through the press as well. So we're actually warning these poor guys, who are actually volunteering. And they're not very old. It's that 17 to 65 range. So you've got a whole mixture in there. A lot of them have experienced the First World War, for example. What they're going to do against, the 6 foot kind of uber fit, uber driven German paratrooper. It does make you wonder, doesn't it?
Well, they're a perfect bogeyman, really, aren't they? Young, ideological, super fit, well trained. They'll have the best equipment that's available. And I also sort of made a note to myself, they're a perfect sort of scapegoat when it comes to things like Crete, because at least you can say, well, we did our best, but these were crack troops, which helps smooth over the shambles that it sort of was on our part, by creating this bogeyman that people are living in fear of, and watching out for all the time.
Yeah, I think you're right, and Crete is an interesting one, because although we've started to look at developing parachute forces, Churchill calls for this 5,000 parachutists to be made available. Nothing happens really that much until Crete. It's a pretty slow burn. After Crete, we really do start to step up, and we start to drive our kind of airborne technology. We're doing the research, and we're actually moving this forward in a much bigger way. Paradoxically, for the Germans, that's pretty much the end of their airborne activity after Crete. They're burnt out. Hitler's had enough by then. He's lost far too many Ju-52s. He's just about to go into the Soviet Union. That's what he wants to do. He's just been told, we've got the success at Crete, but we wiped vast majority of our resource out. Not only that, but we lost an awful lot in terms of the Luftwaffe and those containing forces that he desperately needs to launch a much more conventional operation out there on the Eastern Front, and he's had enough. So as we ramp up, they decide it's not for us anymore.
And the interesting about that is, there is, as the threat is realistically winding down, the whole guy's probably still getting into full swing, because I imagine the threat, when it was its highest, we were still with our pitchforks, and not everybody had a rifle to hand, and we were still desperately trying to equip these. I can't remember how many people in the Home Guard. Is it 1.5 million or something like that? It's an astronomical amount. So by the 42, we get that film Went the Day Well, where disguised Germans drop into Britain, and I did wonder why that was 1942. The threat's gone. Why do they feel that propaganda film needs to come out then, once in many respects the threat's gone?
I think what you're seeing in 42 is you are seeing that lull in terms of morale, and so we've had some of those quick wins, but losing Crete wasn't great. Some of the experiences that we're facing in other parts of the empire. We're not having many success stories in 42. We're up to 42. And people are leaving the Home Guard. People aren't turning up for drill practice. They're not doing their patriotic duty. So it's quite interesting how British Pathé and other aspects of the media start to drip feed these things in. And, there's a good possibility it's to keep folk interested. The threat hasn't passed. You still need to be on your guard. Yeah, it's keeping that aspect of solidarity going. You still need to be in this together, because if you've got that kind of shared purpose, you've got that shared drive, you're not whinging about how bad the war effort's going and is the government the right one to lead you.
No, indeed.
But the Operation Mercury, they're really starting to push this. You've got likes of Dobson, you've got the likes of your key reporters, your picture post type boys, your super dupers, they're out there going, this is a massive threat. We really need to push this forward. And ironically, they're the ones calling for, why on earth haven't we got a resource like this that's capable of delivering these kind of aspects? And people are agreeing. People are picking up the press and going, wait there, 3,000 troops managed to take Crete. My God, this is absolute disgrace. Outnumbered 3.5 to 1. What a terrible performance. So our immediate response is, it's not over yet. Oh, they still could be coming. But also, don't worry, we're going to create our own. Peer pressure.
Yeah, well, indeed. Yeah. And it's funny because I also sort of think that, the funny thing was, we're 3 years behind, but we're 3 years behind because we have to learn the mistake. We have to have our own Crete at sort of Arnhem kind of thing before we realise that, perhaps these mass drops are not the way forward with these troops, and perhaps the surgical strike, which weirdly the Germans had huge success with at the start of the war, is the way to use them rather than these mass drops, because the only way to do a mass drop is a very mass drop.
We start to go for the Allied Airborne Army approach, and that's what's quite interesting. The thing about airborne is it's about surprise. That's the critical bit. Once you lose that element of surprise, then it loses its effectiveness. And that's one of the reasons for doing it in the first place, is to tie up conventional troops well behind your front line, just in case it's going to happen. But to a certain extent, we get to a point where we're almost expecting it by this point. That's why Crete is such a disappointment, because they're told to expect some kind of airborne intervention. But what it does outside of your traditional aspects of the press and the kind of general populace, it starts to get the Commons asking questions. And you get MPs directly asking questions in Parliament about, wait now, can you tell us, War Cabinet, what you've been doing to work up this, that, and why didn't you spot this opportunity? And then that's where you get the system churning behind the actual scenes that saying, okay, yeah, we are doing it. And then there's the constant bum fight to actually start to get something that can work well. But we're not going to do little kind of clandestine operations. What we're going to do is an Allied Airborne Army. We're going to do full divisions and do this in such a big way.
Yeah, I was trying to think actually, and I forgot to look up whether we'd done any really small airborne raids that are not sort of SOE sort of things, and I couldn't off the top of my head think of any of the ilk of what the Germans were achieving early on. I'm sure there must have been, probably around things like Torch.
Yeah, and there's kind of bits before that. There's the Bruneville raid, for example. That again is a bit of a practice. So Operation Bite-In, so we take that on. Before that, there's Colossus, and Colossus is the one really where we go for some aqueducts over in Italy, and there's no chance of getting the troops out. So we send them, and they blow them up, and it really is a token gesture. And that is very much a quick win, if you like, in terms of your media. That was an opportunity to actually turn around and say, oh, wait, no, we've done this. We can do it too. And that's the important aspect of it.
Do you think the British airborne troops had a similar sort of psychological effect on the Germans? It's
quite an interesting one, that. I mean, I think all aspects of airborne's pretty concerning if you're standard infantry and if you're based on the ground. The concept that that's the front line over there, or is it? I think, it would play some pretty deep psychological factors. I mean, when we send troops in for Operation Colossus, the vast majority are kind of Royal Engineers who've retrained to be airborne. And that's before Crete. This is Feb 41. And off they go, and they blow up an aqueduct. There's no chance of them getting out. The extraction technique was supposed to be, we were going to put a submarine, off the Italian coast, and they were going to blow this up, trek their way out, get on the submarine, and all come back. It doesn't really work like that, So there is that certain aspect of, if you're airborne, you're pretty tough, because there's no guarantee you're going to get out. So you've got to have some kind of drive to want to do it in the first place. I think that's what happens to a certain extent with the British, with their development. There's no surprise that we start talking about SAS and commandos and airborne. They want to get in the fight. 41, 42, there's not much opportunity to get in a scrap with the enemy. Vast majority of them are knocking around camps, in the UK. If they're not already in theatre, they're a bit bored. Airborne offers an opportunity to actually get out there and see some action.
I wondered if one German reaction of how psychological is that commando order where if you're caught behind the lines in a uniform that Hitler gives is some indication of their fear, annoyance. I don't know how you might want to put it, of troops operating behind, parachuting in, or entering, behind from airborne operations behind their lines.
Yeah, and there's a Führerbefehl, as they call it. I hope I've got the pronunciation about right. And that comes from Operation Freshman. The heroes of Telemark and bits like that. We go in and try to take that out. And issues an order, a decree. Anyone not in uniform will be executed, and they're operating outside the Geneva Convention. There's all these kind of bits thrown about. But the one aspect for German forces which is quite critical, particularly German senior officers and high command, what we seem to forget when we're developing this and starting to deploy them is that the Germans have already thought about this a lot earlier than us. So their defensive tactics are pretty outstanding. They understand that, an airborne operation, that those troops are at their most vulnerable in the first kind of 2 or 3 hours after they've hit the ground, when they're trying to group, when they're trying to actually mass up to get some kind of momentum going to actually start and take objectives. And this is what we see at Arnhem, this is the critical aspect, where the Germans just put together these scratch kind of units, small companies that just go out and just cause absolute chaos. And they get over the surprise relatively quickly, and that's what's pretty important. I think what we see, particularly in Normandy, is the actual drops that went into Normandy were so confused from an Allied perspective because they were all over the shop. You actually start to see that where the Germans can't understand what was the actual objective or what, because nobody knew really. Because when you start to see airborne forces scattered so loosely all over the place, I think that was an element of surprise that really was a bonus that no one had quite foreseen for the Allied forces.
Reverse psychology.
Very much so, but all by accident. So, but it's typical war, isn't it? These terrible things do happen. Best later, man.
So actually having these huge forces just scattering rather than the laser pinprick, is it a benefit? What you need to do is have the laser pinprick attack masked by a huge drop everywhere.
Yeah, and you get the fronts that people are dropped on, But what you get with British airborne operations, as we kind of move away, and it's quite obvious the Germans aren't going to attempt an airborne invasion on the UK, late 42, late 43. And we're actually starting to see some Allied momentum and some Allied successes actually within other theatres. And things are picking up a bit. But by this time, we're deciding on mass drops. Not just British, but we're also drawing in the Americans at the same time. So we're seeing divisional drops when we haven't actually got the material capability, in particular with aircraft, of delivering them. I mean, we go to a point where we develop things like the Horsa and the Hamilcar, and we have not got the aircraft capable of towing a fully laden one in numbers. The RAF can't release squadrons of Lancasters, squadrons of Halifaxes, squadrons of Stirlings at the point that we're developing the glider force, simply because they're needed for the bomber command offensive that's going out there every night. We'll make do and mending in such a beautifully and British way, where we've got Whitleys with, if they're not the Merlin 5 engine, the oil's boiling and they're struggling to get these things off the ground. And we almost get to a point where we damage morale within airborne forces because we train them all up and then we can't send them anywhere. We haven't got the stuff to do it. And then finally, we get to Sicily. For example, when we start to kind of attempt to work through some of these mass drops and it all goes wrong. Husky and Torch, North Africa, are pretty bad. And we're using American troops because they've got the capability, they've got the Goonie bird that's available to come and do this work, but they haven't had the time to train them. We get to a point with British airborne that we're almost desperate to use them. It's that use it or lose it kind of concept.
Well, I think the Americans, in some respects, were in the same sort of boat. Because I hadn't realised how I've weirdly just talked to a lieutenant colonel in the 82nd Airborne, And I hadn't realised that some of those guys had only jumped 2 or 3 times when they jumped into Sicily.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
I mean, it's no wonder with 35-mile-an-hour winds, we were bad enough. But if you really have such little experience, that there was so many broken bones and scattered everywhere.
Oh gosh, yeah, and it really is such a terrible, a terrible circumstance. But you can almost see the trajectory of how this is driven, particularly in a British context. So, 41. There's MPs in the Commons having a go at the Secretary of State for Air, saying, wait there, why didn't you spot this? Why didn't you see this come in? What have you done to protect us? And so all of a sudden they're just thinking, oh my God, well, we better crack on then with it. So we develop this force and we give it a huge profile. We really start to work at it. We really haven't got the stuff to do it, but anyway, that's by the by. We develop this big force. And then we can't use it. And then they're getting bored. So we go full circle. The troops themselves are getting bored because they've been trained. You're elite. You're an absolute, you're the commodity that's going to take the war to the enemy. We don't use them. They're off. They're getting out of camp. They're not coming back. They're having a few beers. They're just bored. And then finally we get to a point, when we come to late 43, well, you've spent all this money, and this is coming through the Commons as well, and you're not using it. Can you explain why you've made such a poor investment? And the politics starts to kick in. You've spent all this money, and you're not actually starting to show any benefit with these forces. So they're thinking, oh my God, we better use them now, because if we don't, we're just going to get another political kick in. Then that's the aspect, and that's where, when we start to look at conflict, and particularly when we look at it now, if we solely focus on operations, solely focus on a particular piece of kit or material, we're missing some of the wider aspects and objectives of it. And that is around economic factors, it's socio-political factors, and it affects everybody. So we cannot see military decisions in isolation anymore. We've got to start and consider some of these other factors that kick in as well.
Well, I wonder if you could. It's not measurable, but if you never used those 5,000 men, how much effort would the Germans be putting into protect themselves from a force that never arrived?
Yeah, of course. There's all these factors involved, isn't there? So once the cat's out of the bag with airborne, it's kind of out of the bag. But how effective is it when people are expecting it to come? And by the time we're using it in force later on, people have had time to train against it. People have had time to think about it. So it's all about the element of surprise. Once you lose that element of surprise, then your casualty rates are going to go up. That's why I think you start to see such mass divisional drops. Allied airborne armies, because you need more men to achieve the objective that you've set yourself, because people are expecting it. Coup de main, no one knows. And if you look at Pegasus Bridge, for example, how successful is that? Small, well-trained, a really strategic objective, off you go and you get it. When you start to look at something much, much bigger, then the variables just start to stack up against you. A military strategist will put this in a much better terminology than I ever possibly can. But really, if you just look at it from a project or a program management perspective, it starts to get pretty scary later on.
So do you think in 1940 that actually the biggest contribution they made to Germany's war effort was actually the disarray that they caused within Britain as we scramble to react against a possible landing threat?
Yeah, I think the fear factor, particularly for the UK, was pretty critical. Certainly when our ability to produce and manufacture is affected so much in terms of the home front. We're expecting people to put in a lot more hours than we have previously, particularly in terms of munitions, particularly in terms of manufacturing. And so, yeah, in terms of taking their minds off things like the Home Guard and showing that we can do something becomes absolutely critical. Civilian morale is quite closely measured. Mass observation are out there, they're listening, they're picking bits up, they're picking snippets up, and they're reporting it back. Because without the actual home front, we haven't got the capability to produce the material we need to keep fighting until we can persuade other allied partners to actually get involved in the conflict more directly.
Finally, how real a threat do you think it was? Do you think, how much do you think it had crossed the German mind to parachute people into or glide troops into Britain?
I think, certainly it was there. The blueprints were drawn up. Sea line was planned. In reality, though, if you look at it in terms of the actual effort that would have been required to take Britain, then all the other aspirations of the Nazi regime probably wouldn't have been achieved. It would have taken a vast majority of resource to actually take and capture Britain. But I also think that there was still, there was still a very genuine belief that appeasement could be achieved, and there could be some arrangement made if Britain could keep their empire or keep some of the assets and keep a certain amount of prestige.
Well, certainly to through 1940 possibly. I think it's culturally interesting that even the post-war, that this idea of the Germans dropping into us stays with us, and as you mentioned, it gets regurgitated in things like Dad's Army, and even the Michael Caine film Heavens, it's just gone out of my head. It's not The Eagle Has Landed, is it?
There is The Eagle Has Landed. That's Michael Caine in that one, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, he drops into. Does he drop into Norfolk or Suffolk or something?
Yeah.
It's funny how all those. It's that idea was so pervasive at that period in time that culturally it sticks with us as a sort of quiet obsession of coming round again.
Yeah. And it's always going to be there, isn't it? If you think of it in terms of fiction, it's not a bad idea, is it? It's a good little hook. It's a good little story. The reality of it, though, now that is a real piece of revisionist history, isn't it, really? I think it's best left to our media colleagues, perhaps, to muse on what might have been.
Yes, yeah. Look, Tim, thanks for joining me. I enjoyed that very much. As I say, I'll put a link to Tim's article on the website. Tim's also the author of The Airborne Forces Experimental Establishment, the Development of British Airborne Technology 1940 to 1950. And I also put a link to that on the site. That's it for this time out. As ever, if you enjoy the podcast, you can find me on Facebook, WW2Podcast. And don't forget to become a patron. Go to patreon.com/WW2Podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.